So again, take a couple of minutes to enter your responses to your section on your assigned negotiation tactics. I provided examples for how to start it off for each section as a way to support. You don't have to do it this way, but it may help you think through how you can respond. So accommodating can help me interact with X stakeholder by. And so we've been talking about stakeholder engagement, stakeholder management. And today we're talking about conflict management and negotiation styles. And this is also a way to navigate stakeholder management. And so again, these different conflict management styles, I want you to think through in relation to stakeholder engagement. Awesome. So I see some from accommodating, avoiding, collaborating. We're still waiting for some responses for compromising and competing. So feel free to put those in. While we're waiting for those responses, I'm going to read out some of the conflict management styles for accommodate. So Moonwater Farm noise. Kathleen faced a conflict with her neighbors because she would host events and have little live animals in a residential area. So she accommodated her neighbors by putting them first. She would shut the music down by 11 p.m. regardless of how the event was turning out, even if it meant losing sales and having to communicate with her guests. Kathleen was polite enough to put her neighbors before herself to accommodate their boundaries. She decided peace was a priority in order to keep her farm in this location while still respecting her neighbors. Great, great example. All right, so avoid. Not enough resources to maintain native plants, lack of funding and public interest, zero funding from any direction, organization, no preservation of native plants and habitats, no community involvement, reduction of funds, property gets seized, current existing native plants die, failing ecosystem, no community interaction, lost wages, city takes property and builds houses. Avoiding can help to not get in the way and messing things up. Avoid will allow black mustard invasives to take over and continue to spread. So avoiding in this context doesn't sound like a good option. So it sounds like you all are calling out the challenges with being avoiding in a situation with some of these components. So another way too to think of avoiding too is avoiding interactions with certain people. I know guerrilla gardening is one of the ways that folks avoid different, like, paying attention to certain rules sometimes, not promoting this in any way, but I'm just saying that this is a tactic that some people use. They avoid institutions and regulatory compliance standards by just doing their own thing. I think when we went to Ask Guy Hills, one of the things that they talked about was guerrilla planting the walnut tree, the black walnut tree, because there are some restrictions on taking down or cutting down black walnut trees because of their endangered because of them being endangered. You can't remove them, and so doing things like planting more walnut trees in a way does this claiming of site, claiming of space. And it avoids interacting with certain developers around negotiating because they cannot negotiate the removal of the black walnut, right? And so, yeah, these are some really great examples. I'm going to refresh this just in case. Yeah. So
Quick question.
yes.
Quick question about the avoiding interactions with certain people. So you said avoiding institutions with regulatory compliance.
Right.
Or
So some of what we see in spaces, public spaces, is that some stakeholders, they avoid regulatory compliance by just doing whatever they want to do, right? And that may be an example of, for example, in contested spaces, we see people experiencing homelessness taking up space on public sidewalks, right? That's not legally, uh, you know, supported by any zoning policy, but it is a way that they claim space so that they can live, so that they can have a place to sleep. They, you know, put up their tents. Sometimes they'll put up a stage. They'll build like semi-permanent infrastructure. We talked about that in our lecture in another class that we had. So in this example, I think it becomes relevant where folks are using guerrilla agriculture practices like um, unplanned planting of the black walnut tree, right? They're not going to get a permit for that tree planting or whatever, but they're using it as a tactic to claim space because they know that developers cannot remove the black walnut tree. So they're using tactics like planting black walnut trees as a way to resist development. And even though that's not necessarily in tandem with, let's say, a tree planting uh, initiative that is sanctioned by the city.
thank you. That was perfect.
All right. So I'm looking for some of the other examples from compromise, but and compete. But until then, I'll go over to collaborate. Lack of ADA compliant accessibility. Both of our sites have steep slopes that are too steep for ADA compliance, making it hard for members of the disabled community to have fair access and agency in the site. Our WATNAs would be to create appropriate ramps with ADA compliant slope percentages and landings to meet the needs of those who are disadvantaged from an accessibility point. Conflict issue, no ADA accessibility. Collaborating can help me interact with disabled people by regrading the site and use cut and fill methods where necessary to create ADA access all over the space, therefore giving access to all stakeholders, disabled or not. So that is one of the design tactics that we learned. Um, Designing for disability first, right? And so accessibility first design approaches, I think, is really important because it doesn't deny access by making it more accessible for folks who have disabilities, right? Folks who are able-bodied still can access the site if the site has ramps. Um, and these cutouts that you're speaking of, I think, is a great way. And it sounds like you're proposing collaborating with people who have disabilities to understand what their needs are and understand where different parts of the site would be most relevant. One thing I did want to call out here with the WATNA, our WATNA, so the WATNA is the worst alternative to a negotiation agreement. So what a WATNA would be is if your BOTNA, which is your best alternative to negotiate an agreement, does not get achieved. And so I would say that this example here, it says that our WATNA would be to create appropriate ramps with ADA compliant slopes. So I would say this can be rephrased to say our WATNA would be to prevent a site from not having accessibility, right? Um, our WATNA is to have a conclusion that the site would still have slopes that make it unaccessible. And so that worst alternative, like let's say if you did an intervention on this site and out of all the things that you've done, you still didn't do anything to address the slopes, that would be the WATNA. That would be the WATNA, because you would have not have addressed the most important thing that you saw as an intervention on the site. Now your BODNA is if you got into those cutouts that you imagined, right? You got to do those cutouts, those were addressed, and now more folks are able to access different locations in the site because you address those steep slopes, right? So just be mindful of your WATNA being the outcome that would not address what you feel is most important, and your BODNA is the outcome that would address what you feel is most important as a design intervention. All right, so I'm still waiting for compete, but I do see something here for compromise. So lack of easily accessible water. Something seen in both the Tongva Park, Ascot Hills Park, is a lack of readily accessible drinking water beyond a single point. Compromise can act to achieve these goals at the sacrifice of others, although the exact opposite might also be true. Drinking water along the path at some point was sacrificed for some other goal being achieved, such as habitat rehabilitation. BODNA, easily accessible drinking water sources at varying intervals. WATNA, accessible drinking water sources at a couple locations throughout the site. So that is a great example of framing the BODNA and the WATNA. The BODNA is easily accessible drinking water sources at varying intervals. This is saying that an intervention of accessible drinking waters in an easily accessible fashion would achieve the best alternative to a negotiation. On the WATNA side, is saying accessible drinking water would be limited to a couple of locations throughout the site. And so that would mean that the worst alternative to a negotiation agreement would be achieved with this proposed intervention, right? And so this is a great example of that framing. So competing can help me interact with residents to enforce the need for a wellness center. With competing, you force everyone to have the same beliefs as you. Based on the site analysis of the Japanese Friendship Garden, it is apparent that the residents and visitors go through a lot of daily stress. So to the community must be provided with wellness center. With competing, you would do everything you can to keep all stakeholders on board with your idea. And that's a great example. You're bringing a commonality around the competing interests by identifying something that everyone has in common, which is stress, and the role that the garden would have in addressing that. And I see a BODNA here. Wellness center is achieved in residents' improved mental health. So this is a really great example. What I do want you all to do, if you have not done so already, try to do the example similar to some of your fellow classmates have done, where they have identified the BODNA. What is the intervention that you would introduce in its ideal outcome? What impact will it have on site? And then the WATNA, what would be like the worst outcome to have based off of the intervention you feel would address your issue, right? So I'll give y'all a couple of minutes to specify your BODNA and your WATNA. Your BODNA is the best outcome that can happen based off of your conflict management style, and then the worst outcome that can happen based off of your conflict management style. So thinking about that in relation to the intervention, give you all a couple of minutes to identify your BODNA and your WATNA if you have not done so already. Great job, though. I really appreciated reading how you all framed the different stakeholders on site and the different issues that you all would address, and how the approach of your conflict management style would influence that. I'm really excited for the next part of the class because it's about to get real. Yeah, it's about to get real. We're going to be revisiting some concepts, but digging a little deeper in relation to identity incentive association. And I'm really excited to explore this topic with y'all. So far we've gone through identifying our WATNA and our BODNA. We've also identified different conflict management styles. I want to revisit the determinants of health and well-being in our neighborhoods and really connect that to our identity and incentive association and the context of that as it relates to negotiating. So you all are familiar with this visual. We've talked about this a lot. You know, everyone is within the construct of how their age, sex, and hereditary factors are valued within the social constructs in which they exist. And a lot of these words you see on this visual represent the things that play into those considerations, right? Our neighborhoods and other regions, the macro economics and politics, the cultural and global forces that influence the people that we are. So when we're talking about implicit bias and identity incentive association, we're talking about how our identity condition, our identity behavior, and our identity association equals our social acceptance into our cultural construct in which we find ourselves, right? So again, I believe we talked about this in class, but I believe that our identity is made up of our condition, our behavior, and our association. So what does that mean? So identity incentive is like an internal conversation that's influenced by external components, right? And so our condition, there's a the you know, when we think about our condition, we're talking about our health, our race, our gender, our sexuality, things of that nature. And so those things influence what type of power we have when we share space with other people. So I want you all to think about what conditions you have or what conditions, this is an internal question. What conditions do I have that gives or takes away power? What conditions do I have? There are certain parts of our conditions that give and take away power. And these are all perceived things. Some of these things aren't necessarily in our control. We don't necessarily have to be active in giving or taking away this power, but based off of the constructs in which we exist in, our conditions influence what power we get or what power is taken away from us. It also is our behavior. What behavior do I exhibit to maintain power or that interferes with my power attainment, right? So some people perform behaviors to maintain a sense of power, maintain a sense of authority. And some people have behaviors that prevent this social acceptance of getting that power or that, you know. And when we're talking about association, sometimes our association, whether it be through money, our family name, or, you know, like let's say in high school, if you're a jock and you were on the football team and that gave you some really cool points, or you were a cheerleader, you were, you know, doing the cheering thing and that gave you some cool points. Some people were like in performing theater, that probably gave you some cool points. So just depending on what associations you have, right, that can give you some power or add value to your identity. So I want you all to think about that, right? And so identity is a spectrum. This visual really communicates like how people could opt out. People can use different synonyms to identify. They can have a self-asserted position of who they are. They can be socially validated, and they can be like this idea of verified, right? Like to the point where they're getting that blue check on Twitter or Instagram, right? But when we're talking about identity incentive association, these are some questions that we'll be doing an exercise with too, but I want you to think through them before we break out, is how does our identity impact what we have power over? How power is impacted by our proximity and how we facilitate power too. Okay. So power over, who or what do we have power over? And what does it allow us to decide? Power proximity, can our presence impact someone else's power outcomes? Power two, what parts of your perceived identity allow you to have access to more power than someone else in shared spaces? So these are some really interesting questions that I want you all to think through, and I want you to respond to them using this Padlet document. So, like I said, this is gonna get fun. This is anonymous, and I just want you all to really just share your thoughts in relation to these conversations. I think a lot of times we don't think about different types of privilege or the different types of access. Um, so I want to leverage this exercise for you to all think through these topics in a way that you probably never have before. But I'm gonna give y'all about 10 minutes to think through it. We'll play some music, but I just want you to think about what comes to mind. You don't have to think hard about it. Just just put the first thing that comes to mind as it relates to these responses. And my goal is to have you get at least one response each to each of these questions. So if each of you can just put one response to each of these questions, and we'll have a few that we can have a discussion about. So I'll leave you all to that. Let me see. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap it up. It looks like we have a lot of a few responses for each section. And then yeah, let's go ahead and make our last few additions to this conversation and we'll bring it back. Let's and we are back. So I'm gonna pick on a few folks to express how that was for them. Let's go to you, Edgar. How was that exercise?
It was good. It allowed me to reflect on strengths and weaknesses. Um, it allowed me to think about certain aspects of myself that I probably don't necessarily think about.
Nice, nice. What about you, Jocelyn?
It was kind of hard just because I don't know, I guess like admitting some things and really looking deeper into yourself is hard to do at times.
It can definitely be hard, right? I think a lot of times when we share space, we look from the outside perspective and we oftentimes point the finger, sometimes can be judgmental, right? But I think it's always great to really look inside, right? And really think of what's motivating those type of judgments, what's the precedent for that judgment, right? And this activity I think starts to have that conversation and starts to investigate those types of questions. Let's go to you, Catherine.
For me, I think it's easier a lot of times, like what Jocelyn said, to look at other people and reflect on that. But then when you're faced to reflect on your own like behavior and conditions, it's a lot harder.
Definitely, definitely. Chris?
Similar things with me is just taking a look at my weaknesses and strengths. And one of the things I realized is that age and inexperience is one of the big things that came out for weaknesses and stuff, and trying to get around that with um, going out there and learning more from professionals and mentors and even just friends and family.
What about you, Hermilo?
I just feel that it was a little bit hard to think about it because those questions were related to myself, to evaluate myself, and something that I didn't think about it until now. And now that I've done this exercise, I still thinking that I think it's important for me also to think about myself, not always concerned about other activities in my life, like working, going to school, I don't know, try to help other people. So because I'm so busy doing other things, I completely forgot about myself.
That's a really good point. We can definitely get caught up in everything that's outside of ourselves that we don't really reflect on what's happening inside, what's influencing inside, and how we sometimes are policing ourselves and others to I would say sometimes unrealistic standards and expectations. And really trying to dissect where do those standards and expectations come from. In this course, we talked a lot about, at the beginning, especially when reading Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, we talked about the white gaze, and we talked about the different ways culture is constructed through literature, and through the built environment. And those constructions create values. They create values in relation to the individual's identity, what type of incentives they get for it. And so my hope with this exercise was for you to all start thinking about your own identity in relation to the society in which we exist in, and think about the ways you get to, access power based off of your identity, or how sometimes your power is impended upon, right? Based off of your perceived identity, and really start to look at that conversation, one, to navigate it and know that, using negotiation tactics is a great way to do it, to get through it, but also how to understand what type of identities your different stakeholders or different people you engage with have, and how that influences maybe how you engage with them, interact with them. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna play a video. It's a really powerful video. It's by Heather McGhee. She's an author of The Sum of Us, a really powerful book. If you haven't read it, definitely should. But this is a quick video from her, discussing how racism has a cost for all of us.
Professor, I think there's a way for you to share sound.
I
Not
am a
sure if
public
you're
policy.
Was
able to
somebody
do
saying
that.
something?
Yeah, there's a way to share sound so we could hear it better, because sometimes it kind of cuts out.
Okay, let me see if the sound is gonna work. 1 second.
Yeah, right before you press share on the bottom left corner of that
Investigative
screen.
data that points to problems in the American economy.
Let me see.
Problems like rising household debt, declining
One,
wages,
two.
benefits, shortfalls in public revenues.
Stop. Share. And then share.
Yeah, and then on the bottom left corner of that screen, there should be
Boom.
a check mark that says share sound.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, and then you can, I think you can.
And I try to
maybe-
pinpoint solutions to make our economy more prosperous for more people. I geek out about tax policy and infrastructure investments, and I get really excited by a gracefully designed regulatory regime. These are the kinds of topics that I was talking about on a public television live call-in show in August of 2016. I was about halfway through the program when a man called in, identified as Gary from North Carolina, and he said, "I'm a white male and I'm prejudiced." He then went on to detail his prejudice, talking about Black men and gangs and drugs and crime. But then he said something that I'll never forget. He said, "But I want to change, and I want to know what I can do to become a better American." Now, remember, my career is about economic policy, as translated into dollars and cents, not personal thoughts and feelings. But when I opened my mouth to respond to this man on live television, the most surprising words came out. I said, "Thank you." I thanked him for admitting his prejudice, for wanting to change, and for knowing somehow that that would make him a better American. The exchange between Gary and me went viral. It's been viewed over 8 million times and inspired waves of social media commentary and news coverage. And I think people were surprised that a Black woman would show such compassion for a prejudiced white man, and they were surprised that a white man would admit his bias on national television. Not long after Gary and my viral moment, we met in person. He said that he had taken my advice. He said that my words had been like someone wiped the dust from a window and let the light in. Over the years, Gary and I have become friends. And Gary would tell you that I've taught him a lot about systemic racism in America and public policy, but I've learned a lot from Gary too. And the biggest lesson for me has been that Gary's prejudice has caused him to suffer. Fear, anxiety, isolation. And it's made me rethink many of the economic problems I've been focusing on my entire career. I wondered, is it possible that our society's racism has likewise been backfiring on the very same people set up to benefit from privilege? Driven by this question, I've spent the past few years traveling the country, researching and writing a book. My conclusion? Racism leads to bad policymaking. It's making our economy worse. And not just in ways that disadvantage people of color. It turns out it's not a zero sum. Racism is bad for white people too. Take, for example, America's underinvestment in our public goods, the things that we all need that we share in common, our schools and roads and bridges. Our infrastructure gets a D+ from the American Society of Civil Engineers, and we invest less per capita than almost every other advanced nation. But it wasn't always this way. I traveled to Montgomery, Alabama, and there I saw how racism can destroy a public good and the public will to support it. In the 1930s and 40s, the United States went on a nationwide building boom of public amenities funded by tax dollars, which in Montgomery, Alabama included the Oak Park Pool, which was the grandest one for miles. You know, back then, people didn't have air conditioners, and so they spent their hot summer days in a steady rotation of sunning and splashing and then cooling off under a ring of nearby trees. It was the meeting place for the town. Except the Oak Park Pool, though it was funded by all of Montgomery's citizens, was for whites only. When a federal court finally deemed this unconstitutional, the reaction of the town council was swift. Effective January 1st, 1959, they decided they would drain the public pool rather than let Black families swim too. This destruction of public goods was replicated across the country in towns, not just in the South. Towns closed their public parks, pools, and schools, all in response to desegregation orders, all throughout the 1960s. In Montgomery, they shut down the entire Parks Department for a decade. They closed the recreation centers. They even sold off the animals in the zoo. Today, you can walk the grounds of Oak Park, as I did, but very few people do. They never rebuilt the pool. Racism has a cost for everyone. I remember having that same thought on September 15th, 2008, when I learned the breaking news that Lehman Brothers was collapsing. Now, Lehman was like the other financial firms that would go under in the coming days, done in by overexposure to a toxic financial instrument based on something that used to be simple and safe, a 30-year fixed-rate home loan. But the mortgages at the center and the root of the financial crisis had strange new terms. And they were developed and aggressively marketed for years in Black and brown middle-class communities, like the one that I visited when I met a homeowner named Glenn. Glenn had owned a home on a leafy street in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood of Cleveland for over a decade. But when I met him, he was near foreclosure. Like nearly all of his neighbors, he'd received a knock on the door from a broker promising to refinance his mortgage. But what the broker didn't tell him was that this was a new kind of mortgage. A mortgage with an inflated interest rate and a balloon payment and a prepayment penalty if he tried to get out of it. Now, the common misperception then and still today is that people like Glenn were buying properties they couldn't afford, that they themselves were risky borrowers. I saw how this stereotype made it harder for policymakers to see the crisis for what it was back when we still had time to stop it. But that's all it was, a stereotype. The majority of subprime mortgages went to people who had good credit, like Glenn. And African Americans and Latinos were 3 times as likely, even if they had good credit, than white people to get sold these toxic loans. The problem wasn't the borrower, the problem was the loan. After the crash, most of the nation's big lenders, from Wells Fargo to Countrywide, would go on to be fined for racial discrimination. But that realization came too late. These loans, super profitable for the lenders, but designed to fail for the borrowers, spread out past the confines of Black and brown neighborhoods like Glenn's and into the whiter mortgage market. All of the nation's big Wall Street firms bet on these loans. At its peak, 1 out of every 5 mortgages in the country was in this mold. And the crisis that my colleagues and I saw coming, would go on to cost us all $19 trillion in lost wealth, pensions, home equity, savings. 8 million jobs vanished. A home ownership rate that has never recovered. My years of advocating in vain for homeowners like Glenn left me convinced we would not have had a financial crisis if it weren't for racism. In 2017, I traveled to Mississippi, where a group of auto factory workers was trying to organize into a union. Now, the benefits they were fighting for, higher pay, better healthcare coverage, a real pension, they would have helped everybody at the plant. But in person after person that I talked to, white, Black, for the union, against the union, race kept coming up. A white man named Joey put it this way. He said, white workers think, I ain't voting yes if the Blacks are voting yes. If the Blacks are for it, I'm against it. A white man named Chip told me, the idea is that if you uplift Black people, you're down in white people. It's like the world's got this crab in a barrel mentality. Now, the union vote failed. Wages at the plant are still lower than their unionized peers, and people there still worry about their health care. You know, it's tempting, perhaps, to focus on the prejudiced attitudes of the men and the workers that I heard in Mississippi. But I'm more interested in holding accountable the people who are selling racist ideas for their profit than those who are desperate enough to buy it. My travels also took me to places where I saw, however, that it doesn't have to be this way. I went to Maine, the whitest state in the nation, the oldest, where there are more deaths every year than births, and I went to this dying mill town called Lewiston that is being revitalized by new people, mostly African, mostly Muslim, immigrants and refugees. There I met a woman named Cecile, whose parents had been part of the last wave of new people to come to Lewiston. These are French-Canadian mill workers at the turn of the century. Cecile was retired, but she had found a new purpose in life by organizing Congolese refugees to join with the white retirees at the Franco Heritage Center. These men and women from the Congo We're helping these retirees remember the French that they hadn't spoken since their childhoods. And together, these two communities helped each other feel at home. You know, for all the political talk about the newcomers being a drain on the town, a bipartisan think tank found that the local refugee community there created $40 million in tax revenue and $130 million in income. And I talked to the town administrator who was boasting about the fact that Lewiston was building a new school when all the rest of towns like theirs in Maine was closing them. You know, it costs us so much to remain divided. This zero-sum thinking that what's good for one group has to come at the expense of another, it's what's gotten us into this mess. I believe it's time to reject that old paradigm and realize that our fates are linked. An injury to one is an injury to all. You know, we have a choice. Our nation was founded on a belief in a hierarchy of human value. But we are about to be a country with no racial majority. So we can keep pretending like we're not all on the same team. We can keep sabotaging our success and hamstringing our own players. Or we can let the proximity of so much difference reveal our common humanity. And we can finally invest in our greatest asset, our people, all of our people.
All right, I hope you all enjoyed that video. To really wrap up today's session, there's Oak Park, Montgomery, Alabama. As Heather McGee mentioned, they never rebuilt that pool. And this is an example of public interest being hampered by racism, right? And so when we see that there is a lack of green space, a lack of public accommodations in communities of color, this isn't by accident. Much of these design decisions were intentional and are rooted in historical racism. So when we're talking about policy and urban design practices and really all the things that we've been learning through this course of addressing equity through design, it really is important. You're familiar with the different frameworks we've been talking about to have these discussions, right? So as you're going into your final projects and you're doing your stakeholder engagement, make sure you're leveraging these conversations, these frameworks and resources, and work to achieve outcomes that are rooted in community-centered stakeholder management. I will be staying on to talk to some folks who have questions. I'm gonna play this video as we head out. What I will say is I need Nawi and Steven to stay on, but anyone else who would like to stay on to discuss their final project, any missing assignments that they wanted to discuss, feel free to do so.
I believe in the light that shines and will never die.
Community-led.
Oh, I believe the fire burns. We stay alive.
For a client, Archbridge in the Gap. And it's a project in
They will talk about us like they talked about the kings before us. These are the words of a believer, achiever, leader of the globe, feed the souls of those in need. I bleed the blood of the struggle, walking over troubled puddles. Hustles in my chest, no hustle, no progress. Extremities of life in this process. Birth of a son, death of another. With love, I caress both mothers and told them who's in control is the one that's above us. I walk where money talks.
You can lower the volume of the video on YouTube.
Strangers, we are the sons of gangsters and stone rangers. If we
The
could,
bottom left corner, there's the volume.
look at the picture. Hard not to blame us, but time forgives.
Just lower it more.
Yeah, this is just the real project that I had the opportunity to, organize the design for. In collaboration with the Los Angeles Police Department, and facilitate, mitigation of zoning restrictions and all of that to get to this collaborative outcome with community-led vision. But this is an example of, in a community where police violence is rapid, gang violence is rampant. So you have these two opposing community residents and police law enforcement coming together to do something powerful and something with a powerful message. But again, this is something that I want you all to think about. How do you connect stakeholder interests, connect stakeholder experiences, stakeholder values to inform alignment around your design intervention? So really think about using these frameworks to achieve that as an outcome. So again, Stephen, now we stay on. Everyone else, feel free to stay on if you have any questions. If you want to talk about your final projects or your midterm assignments that should be due. I also see that some folks still have not turned in their prototyping research and writing assignment. So definitely, as soon as you can, turn that in.
I guess just one more question. Where would we turn in the Botna Watna worksheet?
Post it on Canva.
Oh, I'm sorry, on what? I'm sorry.
Padlet, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Post it
Padlet, on Padlet.
Post it on Padlet, my apologies.
Okay, got it. Sweet, thanks.
No problem.
Have a good night, Reno.
You do the same. Right, Chris, Hermelo, Ryan, did y'all have questions?
Yes, I do.
All right, so I did get your message, Ryan. Thanks for letting me know. Regarding the field trip, I recorded it and I made an iMovie for it. I feel like I was able to upload the other one easy to YouTube, but for some reason I'm not having that success with the latest field trip. So I'm still working on how to post it onto YouTube. So yeah, we're figuring that out. I will keep you posted. The goal would probably be to have it posted by the time we post this class lecture.